Hello, everyone. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, among the more intriguing questions to be settled in this election year are, can Mary Landrieu stay in Washington, and can Edwin Edwards make it there? We'll look at both tonight, as well as the latest on BP, Greg Meffert's remorse, the decline in medical research money, perspectives from Tulane's new president, and the career of record producer Cosimo Matassa. On the charts for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Jeremy Alford, publisher of La Politics Weekly. Stephanie Grace, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And Richard Thompson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate as well. And we're going to go first over to Stephanie. And the start of the week, Ray Nagin started his prison sentence. But last week, Greg Meffert learned what his would be, and he was most apologetic.
He was most apologetic, and it worked for him because he could have faced 8 years, and he got 2.5. And basically, this is, of course, the former tech chief for Mary Nagin, who really got Nagin into some of the trouble he got into because the person who ended up bribing Meffert also bribed Nagin. So, and there were some other schemes that Nagin was convicted of as well. But Meffert, he did what you're supposed to do under these circumstances, which is you show up and you basically ask the U.S. attorneys, what do you want me to talk about? And you talk and talk and talk, and that is apparently what he did. So his attorney actually asked for a downward departure in the 8 years he could have gotten, and the U.S. attorneys agreed. His attorney actually asked for home confinement. The U.S. attorneys didn't go that far, but this is actually what often happens, that when somebody cooperates, both sides will come to the judge and say, he was so helpful, this is the way the system works. Without cooperating witnesses, we wouldn't be able to make these cases, give these guys a break. And, sometimes the judges are a little reluctant because they say, they may have cooperated, but look what they did. So, but in this case, Judge Eldon Felden gave him 2.5 years, which they were, I think, pretty happy with.
And in the early years of the Nagin administration, like the first year, he was like the boy wonder of the administration.
He absolutely was.
Nagin's was going to be the technological administration.
And he found this guy who was going to make it happen, and that was Greg Meffert. And, kind of a refugee from Silicon Valley. People, the whiz, remember, they had the Blackberries. Nobody had seen Blackberries before. We were all so impressed. Like, wow, you can get an email in your hand? Wow.
So when will Meffert start that sentence?
After January, actually. It was supposed to be November. The judge originally said November, and he asked to be able to stay with his family for the holidays, and the judge agreed.
So this is 30 months compared to how many years for Nagin?
10 years for Nagin. 10
years. That's a big difference.
It is a big difference, but that's what happened now. The difference between cooperating and not. Mark St. Pierre, who of course was the vendor who bribed both of them, his role in all this, he got indicted. He was really supposed to turn on Meffert. That was the way this thing was set up, but Meffert ended up turning on him. So you had this contractor who went to trial, got 17.5 years, is already serving those years, and also after the fact cooperated. He wasn't a witness in the Nagin case, unlike Meffert, but he did cooperate. And also last week, the judge reduced it from 17.5 to 5. So again, message, you want to cooperate.
Which Nagin did not do, and his demeanor in court also did not help him.
Still is saying that he's appealing. He's still saying he did nothing wrong.
And still suggesting that he's some sort of a target, some kind of a conspiracy.
Because people didn't like his politics, yes. That's what he's saying.
And one other witness also this week learned his sentence.
Rodney Williams, who was another contractor who also admitted to bribing Nagin in a separate scheme. He did recovery contracts. And he was really the best witness, probably, because he wasn't someone who was really necessarily trying to save his own skin. So he got a year and a day, and he also went into court very, very apologetic this week. And Frank Fradella, I should say, is also awaiting sentencing. He's the other cooperating witness who was convicted.
And so the beginning of the week, as I said, brought the beginning of Ray Nagin's sentence. So can you kind of describe how he showed up and he drove himself?
Texarkana, he showed up with his family. There were big hugs going in. It's going to be very tough for his family. I mean, we were all watching Edwin Edwards, who got out of prison and immediately went back to this kind of great lifestyle. That is not the case with the Nagins. They are broke. They are
ironic the way it worked out. It had to do with all the appeals and the delays, but that the Monday before, Renee Gilpratt went to jail, and then Renee, and of course Renee Gilpratt was out of the Bill
Jefferson
Jefferson camp,
yeah.
and Ray Nagin was just something different, but two major political factions and on 2 Mondays in a row.
And then actually, if you went to one of the political forums last week, you would see Oliver Thomas moderating, because he, of course, he's from another faction, the Bold faction, has been to prison, is now out, and is kind of well into, I guess, rehabilitation.
Well,
So-
I know the public is kind of weary of hearing these politicians going to prison. Hopefully we're drawing to an end for that.
In Orleans, we seem to be done in a while. I think the place to watch is St. Tammany right now.
And of course we will be. Thanks a lot, Stephanie.
Yeah.
Over to Richard right now. And BP, there was a big ruling from a federal judge last week regarding BP. Why don't you describe what is the latest now?
Well, 4 years after the oil spill, Judge Carl Barbier here in New Orleans came out with a highly anticipated ruling from the first phase of the trial, and that took place over 8 weeks last year here in New Orleans. And the purpose of that was to try to determine of BP and its partners in the failed Macondo well, who was responsible and how much liability should each assume for the disaster. And so with last week's ruling, Judge Barbier found that BP was responsible for 67% of the blame. Transocean was responsible. Of course, they owned the Deepwater Horizon and manned the crew for 30%. And Halliburton, which had designed the cement that was used in the well, was responsible for 3%. And so what this ruling does is it finds that BP, rather than just being negligent, was found grossly negligent, and they had acted with willful misconduct. And so the way that all factors in now is into the Clean Water Act fines. And so that was the first phase. The second phase last September was to determine how much oil had escaped from the well. And the third phase, which will come up in January, is the penalty phase, to see how much BP should now have to pay for that. And with last week's ruling, that could push their fines for the Clean Water Act up to as much as $18 billion, and ultimately could push their costs for the entire spill to about $50 billion.
BP's reaction to this?
Well, they plan to appeal, they've already said. I mean, it was pretty clear from that point that they would, and so that'll play out. That could still be, we could be years away from seeing any kind of resolution on that.
So the finding of grossly negligent, which BP disputes, that directly impacts the monetary amount per barrel that could be fined, does it not? I mean, it really does have serious significance.
That essentially shoots up by several $1,000s per barrel, the fine that they'll have to pay in the Clean Water Act. And so that, from the range that they had faced previously, could push their fines up to $18 billion. And that comes on top of fines of money that they'd paid during cleanup and restoration right after the spill and in the years after that, as well as to businesses and individuals who suffered losses as a result of the spill. They had initially estimated that as part of this class action settlement that they negotiated a few years ago to cost us about $7.8 billion, though there was no cap on it. And now they say that it could reach as high as $9.2 billion.
You know, Richard, through all this, I've never once heard it say that BP is in any kind of financial trouble. I mean, nobody's ever said, well, there goes BP. This is going to put them under. I mean, they're obviously a fairly well-endowed company.
They're doing pretty well. Even Judge Barbier's ruling came down last Thursday, and by Friday they had already lost, I think, $9 billion in market shares just from the reaction to that. So in calling some analysts and other observers who have been following this, I mean, it's really unclear whether or not this ruling could push BP toward a global settlement for all of their costs associated with this at this point, or whether or not they just may wait. At this point, they see how much they've got to pay, and that the mystery is kind of gone.
Of course, they've been challenging also the settlements with businesses and individuals. So where is that now? They've been challenging in court. At what point is it now?
Well, for much of the last year, that's been bouncing between district court and the Fifth Circuit in terms of the interpretation of the settlement. And so at this point, they are waiting for the Supreme Court. They've petitioned the Supreme Court to hear their case on that, and they would decide sometime before the end of the year whether or not to take it up and review the settlement.
Are those settlements being paid out meantime?
They are being paid out.
And aren't they also challenging the administrator now?
That's another turn that it actually took last week, is that they're challenging the administrator, saying that he should be removed from this at this point, Lafayette lawyer Patrick Juneau. And so that's kind of seems like BP over the last few years had taken different approaches toward the settlement. They'd gone after the interpretation for how it was. They'd also gone after some mid-level administrators within the settlement to try to say that they had conflicts of interest or they had behaved immorally at different points in it. And so now they're actually trying to take a shot at the top.
So the top amount that they could possibly be facing now is coming to what?
They're right around $50 billion at this point.
Is that more than they anticipated?
That it is a lot more than they anticipated. I mean, even the economic settlement they thought might be around $7.8 billion. Now that's at 9.2, and it could still grow.
So it keeps going up. Okay, Richard, thanks a lot. Jeremy, over to you. We are in election season. I'm sure you're well aware of that. So tell us what's going on. The race for U.S. Senate.
The race for U.S. Senate, I'm filing that under the who knows category because it could very well come down to a few thousand votes. The latest CBS New York Times poll has Cassidy up by 3. A poll I got today from the Senate Majority PAC has Landrieu up by 2. So it could go either way. What I do know is that this race has become very expensive. So far, there have been 34,100 ads run just in the Senate race in Louisiana for a collective media buy of $11.8 million. That's 284 hours. It would take you nearly 12 days to sit down and watch these ads end to end, which is just a wonderful way to spend time, I would imagine.
And who's running the most of those ads?
Most of these ads are paid for by Landrieu and her allies and Cassidy and his allies. The Democratic side, 2-1. They're being outspent. With all this money going back and forth, I think probably the most interesting aspect of this race is the man in third place, Rob Maness. He has some momentum in this race. He's moving. Polls have shown him between 10-16%. He's peeling votes off of Cassidy. He is Landrieu's best shot to win in the primary, and his name recognition has increased 12 points since May.
And so he's a Tea Party candidate, right? He's considered the Tea Party candidate. He is a Republican.
National Tea Party candidate. He has some money from the
endorsement.
Sarah Palin has endorsed him. So he's got the Republicans kind of looking over their shoulders and wondering, what if he wasn't in this race?
What are the issues where he is taking it away from Cassidy?
I would say on the just by getting up and using the word Constitution in his speeches. He's tapping into the Tea Party movement and the right wing, and even when Cassidy first came out, folks were saying that he wasn't religious enough, that he wasn't far right enough. Well, they wanted an option, and here comes Rob Maness. And personally, in my opinion, I think anyone who would have entered this race and threw out a few constitutional quips here and there would have picked up the same support. Rob Maness just happened to be the right man in the right place.
How badly is Landrieu getting beaten up by Obama, or at least association?
Yeah, without a doubt. Barack Obama is a stone around the neck of any Democrat running in Louisiana, where they have connections to him or not. Landrieu, however, has very close ties to President Obama. She's supported many of his policy proposals, most notably the Affordable Care Act. If you look at his negatives and you look at Mary Landrieu's negatives, they're magnetizing. They're moving closer and closer together. And without a doubt, I spoke with a Democratic operative just a couple of weeks ago and asked him, how do Democrats get around this Obama situation? And he laughed and he said, we elect a new president.
Well, Cassidy's taken some criticism too, because he's only accepted 2 debate invitations, right?
After watching Mary Landrieu just get beat up virtually nonstop since Christmas, Cassidy is finally facing a firing squad of accusers who are questioning why he has accepted only 2 of 5 planned debates in October, why he compared the U.S. Senate to a plantation, why he has a $20,000 discrepancy between his state report and federal report. And the answer is that there's net requirements and gross requirements, and that's why there's a difference. But
they're not accepting debates. That's from the Bobby Jindal playbook.
Right. The
times he's run for governor, I think the last time he did 1, maybe 2. I mean, he doesn't debate.
What's most interesting about
that never really hurt him.
It's the incumbent strategy, and we have a non-incumbent using an incumbent strategy. But
and we have this third person, which means that there might be debates without him, which will be an interesting dynamic.
But if you're Bill Cassidy, you're sitting back and you're up 3 or down by 2, and depending what poll you look at, and you're going to go to a debate and you're going to get hit from the left by Landrieu and hit from the right by Maness. Why even show up? I would imagine that the closer we get to election day, if it stays tight, that It's going to be a button-down campaign. That media availability is going to get tight.
Okay, before we run out of time, we need to talk about congressional races too, the 6th and the 5th.
Sure.
6th, Edwin Edwards in that race, and how is he faring?
6th district, I'm going to put that under the bizarro category because this race is really unbelievable, and I'll try to go through this quickly. But we got one candidate, Cassie Felder, who has filed a lawsuit that might draw in another candidate, Garrett Graves, to testify under oath, and he was actually subpoenaed, served a subpoena as he was walking in the door to go to a debate. We got another candidate, Paul Diesel, who has legally changed his name to match that of his famous LSU football coach grandfather. We got another candidate, Lenora Whitney, who grabbed national headlines by calling global warming a hoax, and she walked out in the middle of an interview with the Cook Report, but she spun it into gold by tapping into this kind of Tea Party movement and turning it into online donations. And of course, we have the former governor who served 8 years in prison, and if he wins, maybe he paved the way for Ray Nagin to run for the Senate in the future. But
at least Oliver Thomas.
Look, if you're a gambler, you can go ahead and put money on Edwards making the runoff. I mean, we can call Clancy Dubose a gambit, see if he's taking bets yet. But the new poll came out this week. He's at 32%. He is the choice of 25%. He's the second choice of 25% of people polled, which could mean he's underpolling. So if he gets into the runoff scenarios, he's hitting a ceiling around 45%. But he gets in with the right person, the right wind blows. Maybe. Who knows?
Who knows? The 5th congressional district, real quick, if you can address that.
Also bizarro, can we say? Vance McAllister, the very newly elected Republican, who was caught basically kissing his married aide, people called on him to resign. He announced he would not resign, but he would not run for re-election, changed his mind, is now running for re-election. There's a pretty big field against him. This is the Monroe area, so it's a pretty rural district. It's a very Republican district. But really the only person who's known is the Democrat, the Monroe mayor, Jamie Mayo. So it's the same kind of thing. It probably Mayo has a runoff spots, but it's still a Republican district. And then, on the Republican side, this seems like a good opportunity for someone who maybe was better known, wouldn't surprise anybody. But there's really no one like that in there. There are, there's a Duck Dynasty relative. Of course, the Duck Dynasty people supported McAllister the first time. They've switched allegiances. It's bizarre.
Okay. We're going to move from politics, which is a favorite thing to talk about here, over to music, which is another favorite thing. And Cosimo Matassa, who really helped guide and developed the R&B era.
Yeah, in the 1950s, especially throughout the South, there was a recording industry scene. And of course, it was a lot different now. I mean, somebody could go into a small studio, record a record, and the radio stations were, many of them were locally owned. You could bring the record to the guy at the radio station. They could play it. You could become a star. You wonder if a Fats Domino could do that today, if he could walk into a local station. But Matassa, during the course of his career, operated 3 studios. The most famous was on Rampart and Dumaine. That building still stands. It's a laundry now. If you know where Marty's is, it's across Dumaine from Marty's. I actually worked in there one time when I worked for Gambit. Gambit was located in there, and we think where we did our production was where Blueberry Hill was was recorded. And that's what happened there. Like Matassa had the equipment, and he always said, I'm not a musician, but I know how to pull it. I know how to turn the knobs. And these young musicians would come in, and they'd make this music, and some of them became huge successes. And Little Richard did Tutti Frutti there, and of course Fats Domino and Jerry Lee Lewis. And Buster Holmes, the restaurant, which is famous for its plate of red beans and rice, I think for a quarter, was like down the block. So imagine you can go and record a hit and go have some red beans and rice. And so it was quite the scene. I remember, and the things that came out of Matassa was just local gold. I mean things that are still legendary music in New Orleans. And if you read some of the commentary today, that they're really giving him some credit with what emerged as rock and roll. And I asked him one time, I said, Cosmo, did you realize when you were doing that you were making history? And he said, no, I thought we were just making records. We didn't know, we didn't know anything about history back then. But he did have a major impact.
Absolutely, he definitely is part of New Orleans musical history. Cosimo Matassa, and our condolences certainly to his family. Thanks a lot, Errol. Stephanie, you wrote a piece about the phenomenal thing that became the Ice Bucket Challenge and the incredible amount of money that was earned for that for ALS research. However, we're seeing seeing less and less dollars come from the feds in terms of...
It's true, and it's really interesting to juxtapose the two, because the ALS Challenge, of course, people in New Orleans have been kind of following what's going on with this disease for a while, ever since the Steve Gleason story started. But it turns out people all over the country are, and this ice bucket challenge, people would film videos. I mean, the idea is it was a challenge, so either if you don't write a check, you dump a bucket of ice over your head. People were doing both, basically. Yeah. So it just became a phenomenon, and celebrities doing it, Governor Jindal did it, everybody's doing it. And the money is pouring in to the ALS Society, Team Gleason, all these other charities, to the point where they're not really quite sure how to handle it. But in the philanthropy community, obviously people are taking notice and everyone's trying to figure out how to replicate it. Yeah. But at the same, so clearly it's tapping into something. It's tapping into the fact that people are very generous and caring and want to support
over
cures
$100 million
and things.
Raised, right?
Over $100 million.
And it shows the power of the internet and Facebook
really
and all that to be able to spread the...
But it also there's a contrast between that and what's happening federally, because of course, despite $100 million is amazing, but the NIH budget is basically $22 billion a year, which sounds like a lot, but it's been falling. Mm-hmm. And it's really apparently affecting medical research. It's, it was doing... researchers were doing very well in the Clinton years. It was a priority of his, and there was more money. In this age of austerity, it's been a lot tougher, though. There was kind of a peak when the stimulus was passed. But the NIH director said that effective funding, basically the buying power of their budget in terms of research, has dropped 25%. And what that means is that whereas in the past you would have maybe 30% of grant applications getting funded, now sometimes it's down to 10% for some diseases. And that means a lot of research that's not getting done.
And these grant applications generally come from what, universities?
They come from universities, here in Louisiana it's LSU and Tulane and all the others. And there's tremendous competition, and I think it's kind of interesting to think about this during an election year, because there's all this talk about federal funding and cutting back, but obviously the federal government does some very important things, and this is one of them. And maybe the fact that taxpayers, voters clearly do seem to care about this, maybe it's something we should be talking about.
But no candidate is going to say, vote for me and I'm going to increase federal funding for research.
Well, probably not in those terms, but if there's a way to talk about it, if there's a way to ask about it, who knows? Because
it is certainly vitally important. I mean, look what happened with AIDS research.
Of course.
And there's years of AIDS research finally coming up with
and that was a lot of that was prompted by activists, by people. I mean, look at breast cancer, look at the Komen Foundation. I mean, activism, politicians listen to voters, and voters are the people who are driving these very successful drives.
But how much money do research institutions here, universities in Louisiana get, would you say, each year?
About $133 million in, I think that was 2003.
Okay. All right, Stephanie, thanks a lot. Right now we're going to go over to Richard, and you've had some conversations with the new president of Tulane University. Tell us, how does he like New Orleans, number one? How does he like his new job, and what does he see as the opportunities before him and the challenges, would you say?
Well, it sounds like he's really into it, and it'd be hard not to. I mean, he's coming into Tulane at a point where it's enjoying a prosperity that other schools around here could only envy. They've just last week opened up their new $70 million, 30,000 seat stadium. They just opened a new dorm on Broadway. And so one thing that really stood out to him from talking with him is that he's coming from Penn Law, where he was the dean for about 14 years. But one thing that he worked to do there was to try to integrate the law program with other programs there and other certificate and joint degree options. And so now, over that time, they're able to offer, in the last few years, programs between the law school and the engineering school or the business school, so that you can graduate with a law background and also business training.
At Penn, they did
and
this,
management.
Yeah.
And so he's, I think, eyeing trying to do some of these integrated study programs within Tulane.
So that's one of his focuses.
That seems to be, yeah. And from calling around to some of the folks on the board at Penn, that seemed to be something that really stood out to him early on as an opportunity to kind of integrate that here as well.
And talking to him, what has stood out to you about him as a leader, as about an academic, as about a new member of our community?
Well, he's got a very impressive record with fundraising at Penn from speaking with him and just looking at the numbers. And I think that's one thing that Tulane could certainly, any school at this point, could use the help with. But that's an area that I think, especially with the new stadium, bringing alumni back to campus, seeing things around, the changes that they'll be able to excel with.
Yeah, that was just so successful. I mean, last week we saw a full stadium, and hopefully that's what they'll continue to see. Are they playing at home again this week? Do we know?
They are, yes.
Is it full again? Do you have any idea?
You know, the first game sold out in 14 minutes. I know there's a lot of people that had season tickets from it too, so I imagine it'll be another full game uptown.
The big thing is it's a night game.
Yes.
3 o'clock's kind of brutal, okay? But 7 o'clock they're playing South. So it's a game they should win, and it's at night.
Yeah,
so
you know, September in the afternoon, it definitely can be kind of brutal. But you know, Tulane seems to be doing pretty strongly at a time when other institutions of higher learning are really struggling right now. They're seeing enrollment drop. They're having really problems with their budget. How does he foresee Tulane maintaining this status and really, you know, being able to be successful in the way they are and keeping their enrollment up and keeping their money up?
Well, I think the allure of going to Tulane and to living in New Orleans as an undergraduate is only getting more appealing to a lot of folks across the country as they're starting to look at schools. And so I think he's inherently got an advantage there.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, we've seen the cuts throughout the last year at UNO and as well as at Loyola. So
and enrollment drops.
And enrollment drops. So there's just
such a real challenge.
I think Scott Cowan gets a lot of credit too.
I think so.
With Tulane, like he made Tulane a rallying point after Katrina. I mean, he made it a mission, and even like students who came in, I think that they were excited to come here to be part of the recovery.
And they made that a requirement. There's actually a public service requirement,
Right.
so it's really kind of a niche that Tulane has developed that a lot of students really find
But
appealing.
is the new president going to go into the boot as opposed to just standing outside of the boot?
So far, he says he's been outside the boot and hasn't been inside. I don't know. I mean, time will tell. Maybe he'll go over to the dough bowl for a slice.
He'll learn more and more about New Orleans as each day goes by. Okay, time to look ahead. Errol?
Some people don't know what the boot is. Okay, that's the bar.
That's a bar,
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. October 4th, Pelicans preseason starts. October 26th, the regular season starts. The game that's going to confuse some people around the country is November 4th. The Pelicans will be playing the Hornets, because they've given the name back to Charlotte, and so Charlotte will be the Hornets. So November 4th, the Hornets will be here.
That is going to be kind of confusing. Jeremy, but not for basketball fans. Jeremy?
I'm going to be looking at a man named Dr. Ralph Abraham. He's a candidate in the 5th District. I think he has the momentum in that race right now. His fundraising is improving, and it also plays into the fact that Louisiana voters seem to love physician politicians. Mm-hmm. We have 3 in the House right now. The man who held that seat previously, Dr. John Cooksey, is supporting Ralph Abraham. So I think he may be the dark horse in that race.
All right, Jeremy, Stephanie?
Okay. The Louisiana gay marriage case was decided recently. Judge Martin Feldman, he's an outlier. Basically, he upheld the state's ban. He's the only district judge to do so. It's now going to the 5th Circuit Court of Appeal, where they already have a Texas case waiting for them. It's on its way to the Supreme Court quickly. And if the 5th Circuit, which is very conservative, finds differently than the other circuit district courts, that really sets up a Supreme Court
Thanks
decision.
a lot, Stephanie. Richard?
On Monday in St. John Parish, sentencing is scheduled for Errol and Tanya Victor, who were accused of brutally beating their young 8-year-old son a few years ago, and so there'll be a lot of attention on that as well.
All right. Thanks a lot, you guys, for being here. Thank you so much for joining us. We want to see you in 2 weeks. We are preempted next week because of the Roosevelts, the PBS series by Ken Burns. So we'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a good evening.